It's monsoon season, and thanks to global warming, the rains are particularly heavy. All along the rivers that flow out of the Indus Valley and to the ocean, people are already fleeing for higher ground, fearful of the historic floods that have devastated Pakistan. Workers at Pakistan's Mangla Dam, nestled in the Mirpur district of northeastern Pakistan, are in full-blown crisis mode. Alarms blare as engineers scramble to release water, desperately trying to prevent a catastrophic breach. The reservoir is dangerously full, as millions of tons of water press against the dam. The outflow is barely keeping pace with the incoming rain. A low, ominous rumble begins to rise in the distance, growing louder by the second. Eyes turn upstream and panic erupts. A torrent of water rushes down the river toward the reservoir. India has just unleashed its secret weapon of mass destruction, and over half of Pakistan is going to feel the effects. In June 2022, the monsoon rains were heavier than they'd ever been, and Pakistan was struggling to contain the rising waters along its many river valleys. The nation built a series of dams to stop the historic flooding that has devastated the countryside for millennia. But in modern times, those dangerous floodwaters are used to provide clean electricity to millions of people. But things were about to go horribly wrong. As if the heavy monsoon rains weren't bad enough, temperatures were higher than their historical norm thanks to global warming. Scientists had been warning about this moment for years, but while political leaders in wealthier nations argued over climate data, Pakistan was about to become one of the first true victims of a global crisis it didn't cause. Hundreds of miles away in the Himalayas, seasonal temperatures were several degrees above normal. This tiny difference, barely noticeable to most humans, was increasing the rate of melt in the glaciers high up in the mountains by a few percentage points. Across a vast mountain range and trillions of tons of ice, those few percentage points added up to a regional catastrophe. As the monsoon rains joined the overflow of meltwater from the Himalayas, there was nothing that could stop one of the worst floods in human history. Over 1,700 people were caught unaware by the rapidly rising floodwaters, drowning inside of their homes or trapped in their cars. 13,000 people were injured, and 33 million Pakistanis were displaced, left homeless, jobless, and hopeless. It was the worst man-made disaster in modern history. But as bad as the 2022 Pakistan floods were, what if we told you that India could make this level of flooding basically on demand? Even worse, India also has the power to make its nearly century-long rival, Pakistan, die of thirst. For perspective, though, just how bad were the 2022 floods? Given that many of the regions affected are poor and the spotty nature of Pakistani government bureaucracy, it's estimated that 2 million homes were destroyed by floodwaters. 2 million homes is equivalent to losing 2 entire New York cities. Whole families lost everything in an instant, and because many of the hardest-hit areas were already struggling with poverty and under-resourced government support, millions of Pakistanis were left homeless overnight. Even today, many survivors are still living in temporary shelters or in abject poverty. Attempts to help those affected and rebuild were both hampered by the fact that the flooding wiped out 150 bridges and over 2,200 miles of roads. That is almost the length from New York to Los Angeles. Post-flood recovery was also further hampered by the fact that Pakistan relies on farming for 24% of its GDP, and the floods had wiped out 2 million acres of crops, ready to be harvested. Not only did Pakistan lose billions from its economy, the nation immediately suffered from serious food insecurity, prompting the UN to start a global food aid response. And just as the waters receded and rebuilding could begin, a second catastrophe began to unfold. The flooding affected a full one-third of Pakistan, an area about 25% larger than the entire state of Texas. When the waters receded, they left behind stagnant pools the size of the Great Lakes, and that led to a mosquito and parasite population boom of unprecedented scale. Malaria, dysentery, and various other waterborne diseases broke out, overwhelming Pakistan's struggling health services and prompting a second global emergency response. 2.1 million people would be treated just for malaria alone. Now that you've got a solid grasp on the scale of the disaster, imagine if India had the ability to replicate it on demand, because it can. The Indus River feeds a network of rivers and mountain springs that wind their way out of the Himalayas on their way to the ocean. The mighty Himalayas add their seasonal meltwater to the river, making it one of the largest water networks on the planet. Starting in small mountain springs in western Tibet, the river flows northwest into the disputed region of Kashmir, which Pakistan and India have been fighting about since they gained independence. From there, the waters weave their way across both the Indian and Pakistani border before hooking into Pakistan once more and emptying out into the Arabian Sea. With a drainage area of 430,000 square miles, it's one of the 50 largest rivers in the world in terms of average annual flow, and it waters very fertile land. The Indus River Delta would regularly receive millions of tons of silt washed down from the mountains, helping fertilize the land on its way to the ocean. However, the construction of a widespread network of dams has limited this self-renewing process. Still, taming the waters of the Indus River system has allowed for a massive increase in agricultural activity and the generation of clean electricity for millions. It's also helped control the historically deadly floods that frequently struck the region. Poor management, however, has led to serious silt buildup and growing ecological damage, causing Pakistan's arable land to become increasingly saline. Over 30% of the country's farmland is now too salty to be productive. Ironically, the catastrophic floods of 2010 and 2022 were, in a way, a good thing, as they helped bring in badly needed silt to enrich the land. Unfortunately, runaway pollution and mismanagement is increasingly affecting Pakistan's farmlands and farmers both. In response, India has more than once considered lending a helping hand by flooding a third of Pakistan on command. India controls a vast network of dams upstream from Pakistan, designed to manage flooding, support irrigation, and generate electricity. But on several occasions, sudden discharges from these dams have either triggered flooding or significantly raised flood risks downstream in Pakistan. Frequently, Pakistan has accused India of purposefully discharging water so as to disrupt farming. But if it really wanted to, India could do far worse than that. It's not as simple as releasing waters from the various reservoirs under Indian control, though that would certainly lead to uncontrollable flooding. For maximum effect, India would need to time its discharges with a heavy monsoon, replicating the 2022 disaster. Luckily for India, and unluckily for Pakistan, thanks to global warming, seasonal monsoons are predictably heavy enough for India to repeatedly unleash its water weapon of mass destruction on Pakistan every single year. The issue has recently come to light as hostilities between India and Pakistan explode over the recent terror attack that rocked India. On April 22nd, 4 terrorists from the Resistance Front, an Islamic terror group, ambushed tourists outside of Pahalgam in Kashmir. Armed with assault rifles, the gunmen forced the tourists to recite Islamic verses, and those who couldn't were shot at point-blank range. India immediately launched a manhunt and vowed to destroy the terror group. The Resistance Front is itself an offshoot of Lashkar-e-Taiba, a terror group based in Pakistan responsible for various terror attacks, including the November 2008 Mumbai attacks, where for 4 days a group of terrorists staged attacks across Mumbai. 166 victims would die, along with 300 injured and 9 of the 10 attackers. The April attack immediately skyrocketed tensions between India and Pakistan, with India accusing Pakistan of backing the terrorists who staged the attack. A series of border clashes and an air battle, the details of which remain unclear, was followed by a tenuous ceasefire in May 2025. But is Pakistan really responsible? And if India wants to retaliate in a massive way, could it use its water superweapon to do so? To the first question, there's no known link at this time between Pakistan and the terrorists who struck in Kashmir. However, Pakistan has a long track record of aiding, funding, training, and even sheltering terrorists. After the 2008 Mumbai attacks, Interpol issued warrants for 2 Pakistani army officers, though Pakistan denied any official connection. Nonetheless, the former Pakistani president Pervez Musharraf publicly admitted that the country had supported and trained terrorist groups, including Lashkar-e-Taiba, to carry out attacks inside of Kashmir against Indian forces. It's also well known that Pakistan had been double-crossing the United States during the entire war in Afghanistan. Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence, or ISI, was helping shelter Taliban forces from U.S. targeting by allowing them to cross the border from Afghanistan, seeking refuge in the unregulated tribal lands of the north. Whenever U.S. forces shared intelligence with Pakistan about a pending raid or an attack on a Taliban or al-Qaeda position, there would mysteriously be nobody there when U.S. troops arrived. Captured terrorists several times attested to receiving support from Pakistani officials, including training, weapons, funding, and even medical aid after being wounded in combat against U.S. forces. And then there was Osama bin Laden, who had made his hideout in a city that could best be compared to the Pakistani version of West Point. Abbottabad is a very important city for Pakistan's military leadership, housing the nation's elite military academies, such as Pakistan Military Academy and Army Burnhall College. The odds of the world's most wanted terrorist hiding out there and Pakistani intelligence knowing nothing about it are near zero. Instead, though, nothing's been made official. It's extremely clear that Pakistan was purposefully hiding bin Laden from the US, hoping to cash him in sometime in the future in exchange for political or military favors. It would go a long way toward explaining why Pakistan punished so severely anyone linked to the CIA effort to locate and confirm bin Laden's location. But the US administration at the time refused to be manipulated and approved the infamous mission which would kill Osama bin Laden right in the Pakistan military's backyard, humiliating Pakistan in the process. The precedent for Pakistan having backed the recent terror attack in Kashmir not only exists, but is backed by historical evidence that Pakistan regularly engages in the use of terrorists to carry out political objectives. So, armed with this evidence and a whole lot of righteous fury, India could choose to flood Pakistan. But it might actually be doing something even worse. Shortly before the start of a military operation to strike at terrorists inside of Pakistan, India announced that it was suspending the Indus Water Treaty. This came as a shock to the world, but especially to Pakistan, because if India suspends the treaty, Pakistan will basically die of thirst. Rather than flood Pakistan, India looks to be threatening to simply choke Pakistan to death by cutting off access to its water. The treaty as it stood granted India control over the three eastern rivers of the Indus River system, the Beas, Ravi, and Sutlej. Control over the Indus, Chenab, and Jhelum were given to Pakistan. This would amount to India receiving 30% of the water from the system and Pakistan 70%, a fact that India has long resented. India's complaints that the treaty was always fundamentally unfair may not be unjustified. The treaty was drawn up at a time when Pakistan enjoyed the favor and the support of large Cold War powers such as the United States and China. The treaty allows for India to have limited use of Pakistan's rivers for irrigation and non-consumptive processes, or any use of the river that doesn't use up a significant amount of the flowing water. Thus, India has built hydroelectric dams and fish farms in the reservoirs, still allowing the water to flow through to Pakistan as necessary by treaty. With the treaty out the window, India looks poised to do as it wants with the rivers that run through its territory well before they reach Pakistan, and India has good arguments to do so. Other than seeking vengeance for decades of Pakistan's terrorist support, India's industry in Kashmir is in serious need of re-engineering of the river waters. As fish farming grows, India could use more water to expand its operations there, providing jobs to many in Kashmir. Plus, the way the treaty currently sits is imposing difficulties on India's attempts to both mitigate flooding and protect its current water levels in the face of global warming. With 5 new hydroelectric dams planned, India is quite serious about either renegotiating the Indus Water Treaty or simply leaving it altogether. Already, India has suspended sharing of the real-time flow data, which complicates matters for Pakistani hydroelectric engineers further down the river. As India's Prime Minister Modi put it, blood and water cannot flow simultaneously. As of May 2025, there is no link between Pakistan and the April terror attack. But to assume Pakistan's innocence would be to completely disregard historical precedent and the outright testimony of a former prime minister. Even if Pakistan wasn't behind the terror attack, from India's point of view, Pakistan has decades of terror victims to answer for. It has engaged in destabilizing behavior inside of Kashmir for nearly a century now. For Pakistan, the threat is extreme, and the results are just as deadly as if India had turned to the use of weapons of mass destruction. 80% of Pakistani farmland relies on the Indus Water Treaty. Even a small drop in water levels would significantly impact the growing of rice, cotton, wheat, and basmati rice, as well as its huge textiles industry. Pakistan's Tarbela and Mangla dams, which provide 30% of Pakistan's electricity, could face disaster. The lower the water, the less power output from these critical pieces of infrastructure, keeping the lights on for millions of Pakistanis. A more serious cut of water would crash Pakistan's farming economy. Millions of Pakistanis would lose their farming or farm-supporting job. Pakistan's cities, many of which are already under massive strain from government mismanagement, would fall into chaos as millions of poor farmers migrated into them, hoping to find reliable work. But the loss of those farms would also mean a loss in crops, prompting a disastrous famine. But unlike in 2022, this would not be a one-time event. India would permanently starve Pakistan into submission at the same time that the country is dying of thirst. It's an almost unthinkable proposition, and one that wouldn't come without significant political blowback for India. But it is perfectly within India's ability to do so. Pakistan would be forced to turn to the international community for help, and there, it could only find 4 players with any amount of political power to actually do something about it. The first response would come from the EU, likely a firm diplomatic rebuke, and not much else. It's not that the EU is geopolitically useless, but let's face it, this is a bloc that still hasn't found the collective will to push back against an invasion happening right on its doorstep. It's hardly going to dive headfirst into a conflict thousands of miles away. Next up is the United States. Pakistan's betrayal is fresh in the minds of the Afghan war vets and the politicians who oversaw the conflict. Pakistan's sheltering of the Taliban and al-Qaeda cost American lives and untold billions of American taxpayer money. But more to the point, the US needs India in order to keep China off balance in the region. With the US and India flirting about the possibility of Indian F-35s, Pakistan might well be on its own. Russia has long flexed its Cold War-era influence in the region, shaping regional politics with calculated precision. But with its war in Ukraine draining men, money, and equipment, Moscow doesn't have the muscle to spare anymore. And then, well, there's China. And here Pakistan may have an ace, if China doesn't also grow tired of Pakistan's terror ties. China has taken advantage of the US-Pakistan split to move into the country, financing huge infrastructure projects and delivering much-needed modern military aid. In fact, it's believed that it was modern Chinese fighters and missiles that were responsible for what is turning out to be a humiliating aerial defeat of Indian forces in the recent clash. Not only does China have the military and political leverage to pressure India, it's now beating India at its own game. China is currently building the world's largest hydropower dam on the Yarlung-Tsangpo River, known as Brahmaputra by India. This project will surpass even the mighty Three Gorges Dam in power output, and it'll be an engineering marvel. However, the dam will also allow China to directly control the flow of water along a river that is one of India's most important for agriculture, drinking water, and hydropower generation. India has loudly protested this project, given the obvious implications if China succeeds. But it's exactly this Chinese dam which might be why India decided to suspend the Indus Waters Treaty. The recent terror attack may simply have been the excuse India needed. With Pakistan as a close ally of China, India's potential expansion of dams along the Indus River is as much a strategic countermeasure as an infrastructure project. If China tries to squeeze India by restricting upstream water flow, India could retaliate by doing the same to Pakistan. In effect, what India is considering doing is a good old-fashioned Mexican standoff, with everyone having a gun pointed at each other and nobody wanting to be the first to pull the trigger. But Pakistan may not be able to sit quietly while India builds the leverage to control its drinking water. Given that dam construction would take years, Islamabad could decide that it's better to act militarily before India finishes the job. The problem is Pakistan's military is significantly weaker than India's, though it could turn to outside powers to help in its fight against India, powers like China and its network of terror contacts. Pakistan, though, does have one option for ensuring India does not choke it into submission, and arguably it would be justified in deploying it. Nuclear weapons are in theory only to be used in case of national survival per Pakistani doctrine. But damming off Pakistan's water lifeline would constitute exactly the type of threat it acquired nukes for. An attack could be conventional or carried out with the use of special forces, targeting Indian dams in an attempt to limit an Indian nuclear retaliation. The future of the two nations and the Indus Waters Treaty remains uncertain, and the whole world is watching, holding its breath to see who makes the first move. If India really wanted to pull the trigger on its water weapon, how do you think the world would react? Would Pakistan retaliate, or would global powers intervene? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out What If Every Country Launched Nuclear Weapons Minute by Minute, or click this other video instead.